to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. I apologize for the delay of this episode, but I've actually been pretty sick this past week and I just didn't have the energy to do much of anything. And today I woke up feeling half decent and going to attempt to record. This is part 2 of the sadistic serial rapists / murderers, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. If you have not listened to part 1 yet, you should probably stop now, go back and do that. I'll do a quick little recap, but there's a lot of information that was covered last week. To recap, in the late 80s and early 90s, Scarborough, a district of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, was tormented by a serial rapist. 12 young women were brutally raped by Paul Bernardo. His 12th victim got a good look at his face, and the composite sketch that was rendered closely resembled him. Tips were called in, he was interviewed, won over investigators with his charm, and let go. But not before giving a DNA sample. In the meantime, he met and fell in love with Karla Homolka. He confided in her that he was a Scarborough rapist. Instead of being disgusted or terrified like a normal human being, she thought it was cool. In an effort to please her fiancé, Karla offered up the virginity of her younger sister Tammy as a Christmas gift for Paul. Tammy became ill from the alcohol and sedatives she consumed and died that night by choking on her own vomit. Her death was ruled an accident, and Paul and Karla got away with the heinous crime. Karla's parents asked her to push back the wedding, which just pissed her off. She insisted the show must go on. In fact, she called them selfish for suggesting otherwise. We left off with a letter written from Karla to a friend, bitching about how her parents were wallowing in their sorrows over Tammy's death. If they only knew that she was the one responsible. In the time between Tammy's death and the wedding, Karel and Dorothy asked Paul to move out. They were struggling with their loss and needed space. Karla moved out with Paul. Without the supervision of her family, Karla got a taste of the real Paul for the first time. He began to physically beat her. Even then, she still cared so much about satisfying him. The fact that her own sister died while fueling Paul's sexual urges did not stop her from trying again. June 7th, 1991, Karla brought home a friend she used to work with at a pet store. We will refer to her as Jane Doe. Karla invited Jane to go shopping and have dinner afterwards. They ended up back at Karla's house so she could introduce her to her fiancé. Paul wasn't home yet, but Karla made them a drink while they waited. And I'm sure you can guess, Jane's had a sedative added to hers. Once Jane was unconscious, Karla called Paul and told him she had a wedding gift for him. He dropped everything and came running. They again videotaped the assault where Paul and Karla both participated. When Jane woke up, she figured she was just experiencing a hangover. She had no idea that she had been drugged and raped. 1 week later, Paul had his wedding present for Karla. He brought home a teenager, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. That evening, Leslie was attending a wake for classmates that recently passed away in a car accident. After the wake, she hung out with a group of friends and shared memories of their friends that died while having a few drinks. When Leslie came home past her curfew, she discovered that her parents had locked her out. She walked to a nearby payphone to call a friend. She asked if she could crash at her place, but for whatever reason, the friend said no. She decided to walk back home and knock until her parents caved and let her in, but she never made it back. Paul Bernardo wrapped a sweatshirt around her head and forced her into his car. He blindfolded Leslie, planning on her release when they were finished. It was really late at night, more like early morning, when Paul arrived home with Leslie. Karla walked out from the bedroom and saw he had a young girl blindfolded. She basically rolled her eyes and walked back to bed. The next morning, she was like, "You do you, babe. I've got some things to do today." So while Paul raped 14-year-old Leslie, she cleaned the house and took their Rottweiler Buddy for a walk. When Karla returned from the walk, she noticed 2 champagne glasses on the coffee table. Not just any glasses. They're expensive glassware from France. They never even used them. They were basically display only, and here he was using them to drink with this teenage girl. She was enraged. With all that is happening, it's insane that this is what made her mad. She eventually came around when Paul asked her to join on the sexual assault. Just like with the previous victims, the video camera was on. On the tape, Karla can be heard saying, quote, "You're doing a good job, Leslie, a damn good job. The next 2 hours are going to determine what I do to you. Right now, you're scoring perfect." What a despicable human being. Then, at some point during the assault, Leslie speaks up to say that her blindfold was slipping off. Paul and Karla knew that they would be caught if Leslie saw their faces. She would surely describe her attackers to the police. This is the reason, more like the excuse, as to why Leslie Mahaffey was murdered. How did it happen? Well, that depends on who you ask. We'll circle back to this in the murder trial. But Paul will say that Karla gave her a lethal dose of triazolam, and Karla will say that Paul strangled her. I'm no forensic scientist or medical examiner, but it seems to me that the argument should be easy enough to clear up. Regardless of how she was killed, her body was moved into the basement until they could figure out how to dispose of her. The very next day, Paul and Karla hosted dinner for the Homolkas. How can you roast a chicken and wear a fake smile when you know the body of a teenager you brutally raped and murdered is tucked away in the basement? Paul borrowed his grandpa's circular saw to cut Leslie's body into pieces. He and Karla then encased portions of her body into separate blocks of cement. These blocks were super duper heavy. Most were dumped into Lake Gibson. One block was so heavy that Paul and Karla struggled to get it into the lake. They left it sitting on the shore. The suspicious cement block was reported by a fisherman on June 29, 1991. Inside the block were human remains. The lake was searched and multiple cement blocks were exhumed. Leslie's orthodontic appliance was key to positively identifying her body. Although her remains were found, investigators had no idea who was responsible or why she had been murdered. Meanwhile, the very same day that Leslie's remains were discovered, June 29, 1991, Paul and Karla tied the knot in a small town called Niagara-on-the-Lake. Over 100 guests gathered to see Karla in the typical puffy-sleeved 90s gown to say "I do" to her Prince Charming. In fact, they left the ceremony in a horse-drawn carriage. They really did go all out on expenses. After the wedding, they spent a week in Hawaii for their honeymoon. 2 months into their marriage, Karla invited Jane Doe over to the house again. Remember, she was the former coworker of Karla's that was previously drugged and raped without even realizing it. Karla was in charge of the sedatives. I mean, she's basically a pro, being a 20-something vet tech, right? Well, Jane stopped breathing. This time they called for an ambulance. Perhaps it would look bad if another teenager died under the same roof as these two. But then Jane miraculously began breathing again. They called back and said, "Never mind, cancel that ambulance." And they did, without question or follow-up, which seems strange to me. Fast forward to April 16th, 1992. Paul and Karla are out patrolling for new victims, one that they wanted to keep as a sex slave. Right as school was letting out, they drove down the side streets near the Holy Cross Secondary School. They spotted 15-year-old Kristen French and pulled over into a church parking lot. Karla held a map and pretended to ask for directions. While Kristen kindly offered to help Karla, Paul snuck up behind her. Using a knife, he forced her into the front seat of the car. Karla sat behind her, pulling her hair down tight to make sure that she stayed seated. Kristen had the same routine every day. Her parents knew exactly what time she should be walking in the door. When she didn't arrive, they knew something was wrong and did not hesitate to call police. Turns out there were multiple people who witnessed Kristen being abducted and reported it. The problem being, someone mistakenly reported her being forced into a beige Camaro. Paul drove a Nissan. They abducted her on the Thursday prior to Easter Sunday. They didn't use any sedatives on Kristen, but they did force her to drink large amounts of alcohol. Over the next 3 days, she was raped, tortured, and sodomized by the Bernardos, all of which was captured on camera. Unlike Leslie, Kristen was never blindfolded, which could only mean Paul and Karla never planned to release her. Saturday, April 18th, Paul is out buying pizza for dinner when a young woman finds him eerily familiar. She recognized him as a man who had been following her around recently. She reported him to authorities, but the information was, quote, mishandled by police. Whatever that means. I'm guessing brushed aside or overlooked. On Easter Sunday, they were going to Karla's parents' house for dinner. Even though they had planned to keep her as a sex slave, they ultimately decided leaving Kristen home alone would give her the chance to escape. So they killed her. Once again, conflicting stories on what actually happened. Karla says that Paul strangled her for exactly 7 minutes, throwing in that timestamp to sound more legitimate, I guess. Paul says that Kristen was tied to a cedar chest with a noose around her neck. Supposedly, Kristen tried to escape and Karla beat her with a rubber mallet. Ultimately, she died by strangulation with the noose. After which, Karla calmly retreated to her vanity to begin fixing her hair for Easter dinner. Paul and Karla disposed of Kristen French's body in a different manner than Leslie Mahaffey. They left her naked in a ditch 45 minutes away from where they lived in St. Catharines. She was discovered on April 30th, 11 days after she was killed. Her body had been thoroughly washed, all of her hair was cut off, and her fingernails removed. Some speculate removing her hair and nails was a way to impede her identification and hide any DNA evidence from the Bernardos under her fingernails. But it could have been part of the torture she endured. In the autopsy, her stomach contents included her own hair, indicating she had been forced to eat it. The thing about this case that is so confusing to me is how they, or at least Paul, was able to get away with this for so long. He was interviewed early on in the Scarborough rapist investigation, then again after the death of Tammy Homolka. Tips were called in about him and ignored. May 12th, 1992, he was formally interviewed again, and police let him go, saying he was an unlikely suspect for the crimes. What? He looks just like the composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist. I have an idea. Bring in the victim who helped the artist create the sketch and have her pick him from a lineup. Or we took this man's DNA. Since he has come up multiple times in the investigation, let's bump his sample to the top of the list. Weirdly, around the same time, Paul and Karla filed paperwork to legally change their last name to Teal. Supposedly, the name was picked after the name of the murderer, Martin Teal, in the 1988 movie Criminal Law. Even though Martin spelled his last name Theil, and the Bernardos chose Teale. December 27th, 1992, the domestic abuse went to a whole new level. Paul reportedly forced Karla to eat a poop sandwich. I'm not even kidding. He defecated on a piece of bread and made her eat it. Then, he cut off the head of her pet iguana, grilled it, and ate it in front of her. The worst of the abuse, Paul brutally beat Karla with a flashlight, hitting her limbs and in the back of the head. The force from hitting her in the back of the head caused severe bruising around her eyes, and one of her eyes was detached from the socket. Literally the worst black eyes I've ever seen. Karla gave herself a few days to recover, but still looked pretty bad when she went back to work on January 4th. She told her coworkers she was in a car accident. But Karla's injuries did not seem like they were from a car accident. Out of concern, a coworker called her parents. Karla and Dorothy showed up at Karla's and dragged her out of the house. She finally agreed to go, but she wanted to go back inside to look for something. I have my own speculations that she was looking for the incriminating videotapes. Karla's parents drove her to the hospital to be evaluated. She finally admitted that she was not in a car accident and her husband, Paul, physically assaulted her. Her injuries were documented, she gave a statement explaining what happened, and filed charges against Paul. When she was discharged from the hospital, she moved in with other family members living in Brampton. Paul was arrested for domestic abuse, but wasn't locked up for long. Paul Bernardo's DNA was finally tested in February of 1993, 26 months after it was obtained. And no surprise to us, it was a match for DNA found on the Scarborough rapist victims. Paul was arrested and charged with 43 counts of rape. He eventually admitted to being the Scarborough rapist, but the interview was considered inadmissible in court because he was denied his right to contact a lawyer. Next, Karla was interviewed. She thought it was about the domestic abuse, but they wanted to know involvement in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. She played up the battered wife and put all the blame on Paul. She hired a lawyer, George Walker. He was a client at the vet where she worked. He sent her to a psychiatrist for evaluation. The psychological report stated, quote, Karla knew what happened but felt totally helpless and unable to act in her own defense or anyone else's defense. She was, in my opinion, paralyzed with fear and in the state that became obedient and self-serving. After obtaining her lawyer, Karla wrote this letter to her parents and her sister Lori. This is the hardest letter I've ever had to write, and you'll probably all hate me once you've read it. I've kept this inside myself for so long, and I just can't lie to you anymore. Both Paul and I are responsible for Tammy's death. Paul was in love with her and wanted to have sex with her. He wanted me to help him. He wanted me to get sleeping pills from work to drug her with. He threatened me and physically and emotionally abused me when I refused. No words I can say can make you understand what he put me through. So stupidly, I agreed to do as he said. But something, maybe the combination of drugs and the food she ate that night, caused her to vomit. I tried so hard to save her. I'm so sorry. But no words I can say will bring her back. I have thought many times of killing myself, but I couldn't put you through the pain of losing another daughter and sister again. I don't blame if you all hate me. I hate myself. I live with the pain of knowing I unintentionally killed my baby sister every day. I think that's the real reason I put up with Paul's abusive behavior. I felt I deserved it for allowing him to drug and rape my beautiful baby sister. I loved her so much and never wanted to do anything to hurt my Tanzakins. Please believe me, I would gladly give my life for hers. Nothing I can do or say can bring her back. I don't expect you to forgive me, for I will never forgive myself. Karla. XOXO. Like it's fucking Gossip Girl or something. This is also a direct quote from Karla. It was an opportunity to minimize risk, take control, and keep it all in the family. Keep it all in the family. I want to punch this bitch in the face. As of now, Karel and Dorothy do not forgive Karla. Her father said, maybe someday. A plea bargain was accepted for Karla's cooperation in exchange for a lighter sentence, what is now referred to as the deal with the devil. The plea bargain wasn't released to the public so as not to affect the outcome of Paul Bernardo's trial. Karla shared with her lawyer and investigators that Paul had videotaped all his sexual assaults. They thoroughly searched the Bernardo's home for evidence. They found footage, all right. Paul must have known this was coming. He hid the tapes, and the only one left out for the investigators to find showed Karla performing oral sex on one of the sedated teenage girls. She was definitely a willing participant in these assaults, not the battered wife who was paralyzed with fear. You can see why it's called the deal with the devil. But the deal was done. If the evidence came to light beforehand, I think things would have gone down way differently. The tape also showed Paul sexually assaulting the girl. I believe it was Jane Doe. But he wasn't being tried for the rapes. He was on trial for murder. And the tapes of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French were missing. After 71 days, investigators gave up looking. As soon as they did, Paul informed his lawyer, Ken Murray, where he could find the tapes. Ken went to the Homolka home, moved a ceiling tile inside of the bathroom, and pulled out 6 tapes. Paul asked his lawyer not to watch them, and for 3 weeks, he didn't. But curiosity got the best of him. He immediately regretted his decision. He had a daughter the same age as the victim seen on these tapes and said he was traumatized by what he saw. The tape showed the sexual assaults and torture of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, but the camera was not recording at the time of their deaths. Paul admits his involvement, but swears up and down he did not kill those girls. Think about it. Paul raped many women before, but none of them were killed until Karla became involved. Paul's lawyer did not tell anyone that he had the tapes in his possession. He said he felt no obligation to turn them over as evidence. I know his job is to defend Paul Bernardo, but how could you withhold this information? He argued that the tapes did not prove Paul's guilt in murdering Leslie or Kristen, therefore he was not legally obligated to turn them over. When the tapes did come to light, he was charged with obstruction of justice and later acquitted. Karla's trial was first. She was charged with 2 counts of manslaughter. The plea bargain lowered her charge from murder to manslaughter and only had to serve 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3. Ridiculously lenient for what this woman did. She started her sentencing at Kingston Prison for Women. I do believe Paul was abusive towards her, but I do not believe she was forced to partake in the abduction, assault, or murder of these young girls. I think she also got off on it. Notice I said 2 counts of manslaughter. Her sister Tammy was not included in these charges. Her body was exhumed in July of 1993 to complete a second autopsy. They did not find any new information that would lead them to charge the Bernardos with the murder or manslaughter, even though it's obvious that's what happened. In August of that year, Karla filed for a divorce. September of 1993, Paul's lawyer quit. I'm sure it had to do with the tapes and how he felt after watching them. His plan was to use them to impeach Karla Homolka on the stand, but he just couldn't do it anymore. He handed over the tapes to Paul's new lawyer, John Rosend. John was like, "What the fuck?" And a normal human being with a conscience, he turned the tapes over to the police. Paul's trial began in 1995, 2 years after Karla's. The missing tapes were played in the courtroom. The screens were facing the jury and court officials, but everyone else could still hear the audio, and that was enough to give them nightmares. As hard as Paul's defense tried to prove that Karla was the one responsible for killing both Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, on September 1st, 1995, he was found guilty on 2 counts of murder and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 25 years at Kingston Penitentiary. For his own safety, he was kept in a segregated unit. This is a quote from Paul Bernardo's experience in prison. "I'm the worst piece of crap on the planet. Yet I get up every day, I work out, I don't sit there crying in my cell. And I don't feel threatened that someone called me an idiot, where I have to attack. Everyone treats me that way. I have no friends. I have nobody, but I handle it." Paul was labeled a dangerous offender, meaning he would likely never be released. Confusing to me. Why not just give him life? In 2013, Kingston Penitentiary closed and he was transferred to the Millhaven Institution. He was first eligible for parole in February of 2018, which was denied. It came up again in June of 2021 and only took 1 hour of deliberation for them to again deny his parole. Paul Bernardo scored a 35 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist. Let's hope that fact alone will keep him locked up forever. Let's jump back to Karla. In the summer of 1997, Kingston Prison for Women was closing. Karla Homolka was moved to the Joliet Institution. This prison was in Quebec, where they predominantly speak French. She learned French in anticipation for the move. Joliet Institute was nicknamed Club Fed. It's a moderate security prison, and from the photos posted on Murderpedia, it doesn't look like much of a prison at all. She was able to wear normal clothes, so no jumpsuits. In fact, one of the photos shows her in a sexy backless dress. There are photos of her gardening that look like a normal smiling housewife outside on a Saturday morning. In June of 1998, Karla started a romantic relationship with another inmate, Linda Verano. Karla did not consider this to be a homosexual relationship, which is funny because Paul said that Karla's bisexual, and that's why she enjoyed participating in the sexual assaults with him. But the reason she says this is because Linda was planning a gender-affirming surgery once released. The relationship lasted about 3 years, and Linda had this to say in an exclusive interview with The Sun. Quote, "She looked so innocent, but she is still a sick and dangerous woman. manipulative, greedy, and still has a healthy appetite for kinky sex. Karla was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Montreal. This is where she started a relationship with prisoner Jean-Paul Gibert. He was serving a life sentence for murder. In 2003, Karla was sent back to Joliet Institute. Linda was furious when she found out about Karla's relationship with Jean-Paul Gibert. This is when she had the interview with the Toronto Sun and tried to sell love letters written to her by Karla on eBay. Although Karla was denied parole 6 times throughout her sentence, this sick, dangerous, manipulative woman was released after her 12-year sentence. In an interview with the media upon her release, she said, quote, "I want to restart my life in French." She chose to live in Quebec, knowing that she would be harassed if she moved back to St. Catharines. Her first job out of prison was working at a hardware store. Her parole came with some rules to follow. She wasn't allowed to interact with minors because of her history. Another being that she was not to contact anyone in prison or with a criminal record. She openly spoke about doing both of these things in front of her boss. He began recording her conversations and gave her up to the media. He even told them where she lived. She obviously quit her job after that. A Superior Court judge granted Karla a reprieve by ruling that she didn't pose a risk to the community. The judge found fault in the lower court's ruling that imposed restrictions on Karla without sufficient evidence to justify the restrictions. Like, I know we made these rules and you broke them, but it's okay. They were dumb rules anyways. How did this woman get away with so much? She fell in love with her prison lawyer's brother, Thierry Bordelais. They had a child together in February 2007. They married in May of that year, and in December they moved to Guadeloupe. They had 2 more children, and Karla started her own diaper company. Who the hell would buy anything knowing it was created by Karla Homolka? Her tagline was, "Lovingly sewn by me in my home." In 2014, the Bordelais family of 5 moved back to Quebec. For the sake of her children, I don't think this was a smart choice. Parents of other children who attended the same school became outraged knowing who was driving through the carpool lane every day. She pretty much keeps to herself to avoid harassment by the locals and the media. Can't say I feel bad for her. In an interview with Radio Canada, Karla had this to say about herself. "At the time, I was 17 years old. I lacked knowledge. I feared being abandoned. I was desperate for a relationship. I lacked confidence. There are numerous aspects of myself that I was unaware of at the time, but am now aware of." Doesn't every 17-year-old lack knowledge? Are they desperate for relationships, unaware of who they are? That doesn't mean you go out and abduct, torture, rape, and murder teenage girls, even if that's what your husband's into. I would think that most people are smart enough to walk away from that situation. Especially in the beginning. She still lived with her parents. She could have broke things off with Paul if she felt uncomfortable and had the safety net of being surrounded by family. She made her choices. And that is the Ken and Barbie Killers. Again, sorry I made you guys wait so long for part 2. I am finally on the mend. Even though this is late, I'm hoping to be back on my normal schedule again this Wednesday. If you're enjoying killer stories, please be so kind as to leave me a written review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. They really help with the visibility of my show. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. You can email me any story suggestions to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.